"There's only one room left tonight, ma'am." The words came out calm, steady, almost gentle, but they landed in the quiet hotel lobby like the soft click of a door locking behind a long day. Darius Coleman stood behind the front desk, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the polished counter while rain tapped steadily against the tall glass windows facing the parking lot. Outside, a late autumn storm rolled across the highway, headlights stretching into silver lines on the wet asphalt, the kind of storm that made travelers pull off the road and search for the nearest lighted building with a vacancy sign still glowing. Inside the small interstate hotel, the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon cleaner, the hum of the vending machine blending with the distant rumble of thunder somewhere miles away. The woman standing across from him didn't look like someone who had ever heard the words, "only one room left" in her life. Her coat was tailored charcoal wool, still dotted with rain, and the leather suitcase beside her probably cost more than Darius made in 2 months working night shifts. She lifted her eyes slowly from the front desk monitor to his name tag, the small plastic rectangle that read Darius beneath the hotel logo. Her gaze lingered there for a moment before moving back to his face. "You might want to check again," she said, her voice controlled, smooth, the tone of someone used to people fixing problems before she finished speaking. Darius didn't move right away. He had already checked the reservation system twice, watched the last available room disappear 10 minutes earlier when a tired couple from Ohio walked through the doors soaked from the storm. The computer screen still glowed pale blue in front of him, the booking grid filled from top to bottom. "I already did, ma'am," he replied quietly. "Conference in town. Highways backed up nearly 5 miles. Everything filled up before midnight." For a brief moment, the woman simply stood there, rainwater sliding slowly from the hem of her coat onto the tiled floor. Somewhere near the lobby couch, a small boy shifted under a worn gray blanket, his sneakers peeking out near the armrest. Darius glanced toward him without turning his head fully. Noah had finally fallen asleep about 20 minutes earlier after the thunder got louder, his breathing slow and even. Now, one hand still curled around the sleeve of his father's jacket. The woman followed the direction of Darius's brief glance, noticing the sleeping child for the first time. Something unreadable passed across her expression, though it vanished almost immediately as she turned back to the counter. "You're telling me," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "that the entire hotel has exactly one room left?" Darius nodded once. The fluorescent lights above cast a soft reflection across the counter between them. Outside, lightning flickered faintly behind the low clouds. "Yes, ma'am. One room." He paused, then added gently, "And if you're planning on driving farther tonight, the next hotel is about 30 miles down the interstate. In this storm it might take an hour." The lobby grew quiet again except for the rain. The woman studied him carefully now, as if recalculating something she hadn't expected to encounter when she pushed through those doors. "You know who I am, don't you?" she asked after a moment. Darius met her gaze calmly. "Yes, Miss Hale," he said. "I do." The CEO of the company that owned the entire hotel chain stood in front of him, soaked from the rain, holding a suitcase, staring at the employee who had just told her there was only one room left. Victoria Hale did not immediately answer. The name Darius had spoken hung quietly between them, as steady as the rain tapping against the glass doors of the lobby. Most people reacted the moment they recognized her. Some straightened their posture. Some rushed to apologize for problems that had not even happened yet. Others suddenly became overly polite, like they were speaking to a camera. But this man did none of that. He simply stood there behind the counter, calm and composed, as if the title of Chief Executive Officer was just another line in a reservation system. Victoria slowly removed her gloves, placing them carefully on the counter beside the computer terminal. Water dripped softly from the sleeve of her coat onto the tile floor. The storm outside had intensified, wind pushing sheets of rain across the parking lot, the neon vacancy sign flickering faintly against the dark sky. She glanced once more toward the small couch in the corner of the lobby where the child slept under the gray blanket. The boy looked no older than 8. His shoes were scuffed along the edges, and his backpack rested against the side of the couch like a silent companion. For a brief moment, Victoria wondered why a hotel employee had his child with him during a midnight shift, but she did not ask. Instead, she looked back at Darius. "You are certain there are no cancellations," she said, her tone quieter now, less sharp, but still controlled. Darius tapped one key on the keyboard and turned the screen slightly so she could see the booking grid filled with blue blocks from top to bottom. "Every room occupied," he said gently. "The last one checked in about 10 minutes ago." Victoria studied the screen for a moment, her reflection faint in the glass of the monitor. Somewhere behind her the thunder rolled again, low and distant, like a heavy truck passing far down the interstate. Noah stirred slightly under the blanket, but did not wake. Darius noticed immediately. He stepped out from behind the counter and quietly crossed the lobby, adjusting the blanket around the boy's shoulders with careful hands before returning to the desk. The movement was small, practiced, something he had done many times before without thinking. Victoria watched the entire moment in silence. "Your son?" she said after a second. Darius nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." "Noah." The way he said the name carried something warm beneath the exhaustion of the long shift. Victoria rested one hand on the counter and looked around the lobby for the first time since she had entered. The place was modest but clean. A small coffee station stood beside a rack of folded brochures advertising nearby diners and gas stations. A digital wall clock showed 12:37 in bright red numbers. The soft buzz of the ice machine echoed faintly from the hallway leading to the guest rooms. It was not the type of hotel lobby where a chief executive officer usually spent the night, yet the storm outside and the empty highway had removed every other option. "How long have you been working here, Mr. Coleman?" she asked quietly. Darius folded his hands loosely in front of him. 3 years on the night shift, he replied. "Longer if you count maintenance work before that." Victoria nodded slowly. She knew the company reports well enough to recognize the location. This hotel was one of the smaller properties in the chain, often overlooked in boardroom meetings where numbers mattered more than people. And yet here stood a man who had kept it running through midnight storms and late travelers without complaint. She studied him carefully now, noticing the tired lines near his eyes and the quiet patience in the way he waited without rushing her decision. Outside, another flash of lightning lit the parking lot for half a second, reflecting across the wet pavement like silver glass. Victoria exhaled slowly and picked up her gloves again. "Then tell me something honestly," she said, meeting his eyes across the counter. "If there is only one room left in this entire building, where exactly do you expect your chief executive officer to sleep tonight?" For a moment the question remained suspended in the quiet lobby, as steady as the ticking red numbers of the wall clock above the coffee station. Darius did not answer immediately. Instead he glanced once more toward the couch where Noah slept, the small rise and fall of the blanket showing the calm rhythm of a child who had finally found rest after a long evening. The storm outside rattled the glass doors again, wind sweeping rain across the empty parking lot in long silver streaks beneath the streetlights. Darius rested one hand lightly on the counter before speaking. "Ma'am, my expectation is that you have the room." His voice remained level, respectful, but there was no hesitation in it. Victoria studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring something invisible between them. "And where exactly does that leave you?" she asked. Darius gave a small shrug that seemed almost natural, as though he had already accepted the answer hours earlier. "Same place I was going to be anyway. Behind the desk until morning." Victoria glanced again toward the sleeping boy. "And him?" Darius followed her gaze. Noah had rolled slightly onto his side, one arm still tucked beneath the blanket. "He will stay here with me," Darius replied quietly. "He sleeps through most of the night once the thunder passes." Victoria folded her gloves slowly in her hands. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly along the polished counter between them. "You intend to give up the last room in the building to someone who already owns the building," she said. The words were not sharp, but there was something probing in them, as though she expected a different answer. Darius met her eyes. Calmly. "Tonight you are not here as the owner, ma'am. Tonight you are a guest who drove through a storm looking for a place to rest." Victoria did not respond right away. She had spent years in boardrooms where conversations moved quickly, where decisions were measured in percentages and quarterly forecasts, where employees often spoke carefully to avoid saying the wrong thing in front of her. Yet this man, standing in a quiet roadside hotel at nearly 1 in the morning, had answered her question with a kind of steady honesty that felt unfamiliar. The thunder rolled again, a low vibration that echoed through the building for a second before fading into the distance. Victoria glanced toward the hallway leading to the guest rooms, imagining the single empty room waiting behind one of those numbered doors. A warm bed, a quiet place to change out of her rain-soaked coat, a few hours of sleep before morning meetings, and damage control with the press. Then her eyes returned to the couch where Noah slept, small and still beneath the gray blanket. "You brought your son to work tonight," she said slowly. Darius nodded. Storm came in earlier than expected. His school closed for the afternoon. I did not have time to arrange anything else before my shift. Victoria studied the boy again, noticing the backpack resting beside the couch, a small dinosaur keychain clipped to the zipper. "Does this happen often?" she asked. Darius shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. Only when life changes the schedule." The quiet simplicity of the answer lingered in the air. Victoria exhaled softly, then rested both hands on the counter. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice calmer now than when she first walked through the door. "I did not ask where you expected me to sleep because I was worried about comfort." She paused briefly before continuing. "I asked because I wanted to see whether anyone in this company still understood what responsibility actually looks like." Darius remained silent, uncertain where the conversation was turning. Victoria lifted her coat slightly from her shoulders, water droplets falling onto the tile floor. "So tell me something else honestly," she continued, her eyes steady on his. "If I take that last room tonight, will you and your son truly be all right sitting out here until morning?" The question lingered in the quiet space between them while the storm continued its slow rhythm against the windows. Darius looked toward Noah again before answering, the soft glow of the lobby lights resting across the small boy's face as he slept curled beneath the gray blanket. For a few seconds Darius said nothing, as though measuring the truth of the moment against the long habit of making things work no matter how difficult the night became. Finally he nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said calmly. "We will be all right." Victoria watched him closely, searching his expression for any trace of hesitation, but there was none. The answer had not been proud or dramatic. It had simply been honest. Outside, another gust of wind pushed rain against the glass doors, and somewhere along the highway a distant truck horn echoed faintly through the storm before disappearing again into the dark. Victoria slowly removed her coat and folded it over the arm of one of the lobby chairs, revealing a dark blue suit beneath it that looked as though it had once belonged in a boardroom hours away from this quiet roadside hotel. The silence stretched for another moment before she spoke again. "Mr. Coleman," she said thoughtfully, "do you know why I drove here tonight instead of staying in the city like everyone expected?" Darius shook his head gently. "No, ma'am." Victoria glanced toward the glass doors where the parking lot shimmered beneath the rain. "Because sometimes the place where people see you the least is the only place you can actually see things clearly." The words sounded more reflective than anything she had said earlier. She walked slowly across the lobby, pausing near the couch where Noah slept. The boy shifted slightly, but did not wake. Victoria studied the small backpack beside him and the dinosaur keychain hanging from the zipper. "How old is he?" she asked quietly. 8, Darius replied. "Third grade." Victoria nodded slowly, as if committing the number to memory. Then she straightened and turned back toward the front desk. "You offered the last room to me without even asking whether I would accept it," she said. "Most employees would have tried to negotiate something different once they realized who was standing here." Darius rested his hands lightly on the counter again. "Ma'am, storms do not ask who owns the building before they arrive. Travelers just need a safe place to stop." The simplicity of the statement seemed to settle in the room like the quiet after thunder. Victoria considered that answer for several seconds. The wall clock now showed 12:48. Nearly 15 minutes had passed since she walked through the door, yet the tension she carried with her from the highway had slowly begun to fade into something quieter, something more thoughtful. Finally, she stepped closer to the counter again. "Tell me about your shift tonight," she said. Darius looked mildly surprised by the request, but answered anyway. 3 late check-ins, 1 family with a broken windshield from the storm, and a truck driver who needed directions because the interstate exit sign blew down earlier this evening. Victoria listened without interrupting. None of it sounded like the conversations she usually heard in corporate meetings where discussions revolved around revenue charts and quarterly projections. These were small things, ordinary moments that kept a place running through the night while most people slept. She glanced toward the hallway leading to the guest rooms once more, then back to Darius. "Mr. Coleman," she said quietly, "what if I told you that I did not come here tonight just to find a place to sleep?" Darius waited patiently. Victoria rested both hands on the counter and looked him directly in the eye. "What if I told you that I came here because I needed to see whether anyone in this company still remembered what this job is really supposed to be about?" The quiet in the lobby deepened after Victoria spoke those words, as if the building itself had paused to listen. Rain continued sliding down the glass doors in slow streams, reflecting the yellow glow of the streetlights outside. Darius remained still behind the front desk, considering what she had said, though the calm expression on his face did not change. For years he had learned that the night shift carried many unexpected conversations. Truck drivers shared stories from the road, families arrived exhausted after long drives, and sometimes strangers spoke more honestly after midnight than they ever would during daylight hours. Yet this conversation felt different, heavier in a way he could not immediately explain. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I try to remember that every guest walking through that door has had a long day before they arrive here." Victoria studied him, her posture relaxing slightly for the first time since she entered. The lobby. The wall clock ticked quietly above the coffee station. 12:53. The storm outside began to soften, the wind easing though the steady rainfall continued tapping against the glass. She walked slowly toward the coffee station and poured a small cup from the metal carafe sitting on the warmer. Steam rose gently in the quiet room. When she turned back toward the desk, she held the cup in both hands as if appreciating the simple warmth. "Do you know what people usually say about companies like mine?" she asked calmly. Darius shook his head once. "No, ma'am." Victoria took a small sip before answering her own question. "They say we talk about service, but we measure success in numbers. Occupancy rates, revenue per room, efficiency reports." Her voice carried no anger, only a kind of quiet reflection. She looked again toward Noah sleeping on the couch. Yet the people who keep these places alive through nights like this rarely appear in those reports. Darius followed her gaze toward his son. Noah had shifted again slightly, one hand resting against the edge of the blanket, breathing slow and steady beneath the soft light. Darius allowed himself a small smile before looking back at the counter. "Most nights are simple, ma'am," he said. "A traveler needs directions, someone forgets their phone charger, a child needs a quiet place to sleep after a long drive." Victoria walked slowly back toward the front desk, placing the empty coffee cup beside the reservation monitor. For a moment, she studied the blue grid of fully booked rooms again. 3 years, she repeated softly, recalling what he had told her earlier. 3 years working nights here. Darius nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria leaned lightly against the counter. "And in all that time, no one from headquarters ever came through those doors at midnight to see how things actually run, did they?" Darius hesitated briefly before answering honestly. "No, ma'am." Another small silence settled between them, but this one felt different from the earlier tension. It felt thoughtful, almost reflective. Victoria folded her hands on the counter and looked around the lobby again, noticing details she had overlooked before. The carefully arranged brochures, the polished tile floor, the small potted plant near the window that someone had clearly watered despite the long hours of overnight work. "You know," she said slowly, "when I drove off the interstate tonight, I expected nothing more than a quiet place to disappear for a few hours." She paused before continuing. "Instead, I walked into a reminder of why this company was built in the first place." Darius listened quietly, unsure how to respond to something that sounded less like a complaint and more like a realization. Victoria finally straightened and looked directly at him again. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice steady but thoughtful. "Earlier tonight you offered the last room in this building without hesitation because you believed a guest should have it." She gestured gently toward the hallway leading to the rooms. "But what if I told you that the real test tonight was never about that room?" Darius raised an eyebrow slightly, curious now. Victoria met his gaze calmly. "What if the real test was about the person standing behind the desk?" For a long moment Darius did not respond. The words Victoria had spoken lingered quietly in the air between them, blending with the steady sound of rain tapping against the glass doors. The storm outside had begun to calm, the heavy wind fading into a softer rhythm that rolled across the dark highway like distant waves. Darius rested both hands lightly on the counter, his eyes thoughtful now rather than surprised. The fluorescent lights above reflected faintly across the polished surface, and somewhere down the hallway a door clicked shut as a late arriving guest settled into one of the rooms. The building had returned to the quiet rhythm that belonged to the early hours of the morning. "Ma'am," Darius said gently, "I am just doing the job I was hired to do." Victoria watched him closely, her expression calm but attentive. "That is exactly the point," she replied. She stepped slowly away from the desk and walked toward the tall window facing the parking lot. The rain had thinned now, leaving a fine mist that drifted beneath the streetlights. A single 18-wheeler rolled slowly across the far edge of the lot before turning back toward the interstate ramp. Victoria folded her arms lightly and looked out at the empty road for several seconds before speaking again. When people sit in boardrooms all day, they start believing that leadership means controlling numbers on a screen, she said quietly. They forget that real leadership is about the people who carry the weight of those numbers. Every night, Darius listened without interrupting. The way she spoke now sounded different from earlier. The sharp edge that had been in her voice when she first walked into the lobby had softened into something more reflective. Victoria turned back toward the desk and walked slowly across the tile floor. When she reached the couch where Noah slept, she paused again. The boy had shifted onto his back, the blanket still tucked beneath his chin. His small dinosaur keychain glinted under the lobby lights as it hung from the zipper of his backpack. Victoria lowered her voice. "He sleeps deeply," she observed. Darius nodded slightly. "Once the thunder fades, he usually does." Victoria studied the child for a moment longer, then straightened and returned to the front desk. "Tell me something honestly, Mr. Coleman," she said. "When you offered me that room earlier tonight, did you know who I was before you checked the reservation system?" Darius answered without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am. I recognized you when you walked in." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "And you still offered the room the same way you would offer it to anyone else?" "Yes, ma'am." The simplicity of the exchange seemed to settle the matter in her mind. Victoria rested one hand on the counter and glanced again at the reservation screen. The grid still filled with blue squares representing every occupied room in the building. "Then let me ask you something else," she continued calmly. "If that last room is still available, why have you not already checked me into it?" Darius met her eyes with the same steady patience he had carried throughout the night. "Because you have not decided whether you want it yet." Victoria looked at him for a second, then something unexpected appeared in her expression. It was not surprise exactly. It was closer to recognition. The kind that comes when someone finally sees a truth that had been standing in front of them all along. She reached into her coat pocket and removed a small leather card holder before placing it gently on the counter. The silver letters on the card caught the light as she slid it across toward him. "Mr. Coleman," she said quietly. "Tonight I did not come here looking for a place to sleep." She paused, her eyes steady and thoughtful. "I came here looking for someone who still understands what this company was meant to be." The small leather card holder remained on the counter between them, the silver lettering reflecting softly under the lobby lights. Darius looked down at it for a moment, but did not reach for it yet. Outside, the rain had softened into a quiet drizzle, the highway beyond the parking lot now nearly empty except for the occasional glow of distant headlights moving through the night. The building had settled into the calm stillness that belonged to the hour after midnight, when most travelers had already found their rooms, and the world outside seemed to pause for breath. Victoria watched him patiently, her expression thoughtful rather than demanding. Finally Darius picked up the card and looked at it briefly before setting it back down exactly where it had been. His voice remained calm when he spoke. "Ma'am, I already knew who you were." Victoria gave a small nod, as though she expected that answer. "Yes," she said quietly. "You did." She stepped closer to the counter, resting her hands lightly on the polished surface. "But you did not treat me differently." Darius shook his head gently. "A guest is a guest, ma'am." The simplicity of the sentence lingered between them for a moment. Victoria glanced once more toward the couch where Noah slept, the small rise and fall of the blanket steady beneath the soft yellow glow of the lamp above the seating area. Then she looked back at Darius. 3 years working nights, she said slowly. 3 years solving problems that never appear on corporate reports. Darius offered a modest shrug. "It is a quiet job most nights." Victoria gave a faint smile, though it carried more recognition than amusement. "It is not quiet," she replied. "It is invisible." The words settled in the room like a quiet truth. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The wall clock above the coffee station changed from 1:12 to 1:13 in red digital numbers. Somewhere down the hallway a guest laughed softly through a closed door before the sound faded again. Victoria straightened slightly and slid the card holder a few inches closer to Darius. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her tone steady and thoughtful. "When I drove off the interstate tonight, I expected to spend a few hours somewhere no one would recognize me. I needed distance from headlines, from meetings, from people explaining problems, using numbers instead of faces." She paused briefly before continuing. "What I did not expect was to find the one person in this building who still understood the reason this company exists." Darius listened quietly, uncertain how to respond to words that sounded far larger than the quiet night shift he had come to work. Victoria continued. "Hospitality does not begin with buildings or budgets," she said. "It begins with the person standing behind the desk when a tired traveler walks through the door." She gestured lightly toward the reservation monitor. "Tonight you had one room left in this hotel. You could have used that moment to gain favor, to make an impression, to treat the owner differently from everyone else." Darius simply waited. Victoria met his eyes directly. "Instead, you treated me exactly the way you treat every traveler who arrives here after midnight." Another moment passed before she added quietly, "That is why I stopped you from checking me into that room." Darius looked slightly puzzled now. Victoria gave a small nod toward the hallway leading to the guest rooms. "Because that room was never the important part of tonight." She rested both hands on the counter again, her voice calm but certain. "The important part was the man who offered it without hesitation." The quiet words settled over the lobby like the final echo of distant thunder fading beyond the highway. For a moment Darius simply stood there behind the desk, unsure what to say. The reservation screen continued glowing softly beside him. Every room still marked as occupied except the single empty one waiting at the end of the hall. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle mist that drifted beneath the streetlights, turning the parking lot into a mirror of pale reflections. Victoria remained calm across the counter, her posture steady, as if the decision she had been considering all night had finally reached its conclusion. Darius glanced once more toward Noah sleeping on the couch, the small blanket rising and falling with each quiet breath. The sight seemed to ground him before he looked back at her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I am not sure I understand." Victoria nodded slightly, as though she expected the confusion. She lifted the leather card holder again and turned it so the silver letters faced him clearly under the light. "Mr. Coleman," she said gently, "people in leadership often believe that character reveals itself in large moments, dramatic moments that everyone can see. But the truth is that character appears in small decisions when no one is watching." She gestured softly toward the lobby around them. Tonight there were no cameras, no executives, no reports being written. Just a tired traveler, a sleeping child, and a man doing his job with quiet dignity. Darius remained silent, absorbing the meaning behind her words. Victoria continued, her voice steady but warmer now. 3 years ago when you accepted the night shift here, I doubt you imagined that one stormy night would place you in a conversation with the owner of the entire company." She paused briefly before adding, "But leadership often reveals itself in the most ordinary places." The wall clock changed to 1:21 in red numbers. Somewhere down the hallway an air conditioner clicked on with a soft hum. Victoria leaned lightly against the counter and looked toward the hallway leading to the guest rooms again. "You offered that last room because you believed it was the right thing to do for a guest," she said. "Not because you expected anything in return." Darius nodded quietly. "That is how the job works, ma'am." Victoria smiled faintly, the first real smile he had seen since she arrived. "That is how the job is supposed to work," she corrected gently. Then she straightened and placed both hands on the counter. "Mr. Coleman, tonight I learned something important standing in this lobby." Darius waited. Victoria's voice softened slightly. "I learned that the values we talk about in corporate meetings still exist here. They just live in people who rarely receive recognition for them." She glanced toward Noah again before continuing. "And I believe companies should recognize the people who carry those values every night." Darius felt a quiet shift in the conversation now. something larger beginning to form behind her calm words. Victoria slid the card holder closer to him once more. Tomorrow morning the board expects me back in the city to discuss new leadership positions across several regional properties, she said. They believe the future of the company depends on finding people who understand both responsibility and empathy. She met his eyes directly. Tonight, I believe I found one of those people standing behind this desk. The quiet hum of the lobby seemed to pause for a second as the meaning settled between them. Darius looked down at the card, then back at her, still unsure he had heard correctly. Victoria's expression remained steady, her voice calm but certain. "Mr. Coleman," she said gently, "how would you feel about a conversation in the morning about running more than just the night shift?" The words remained in the quiet lobby long after Victoria finished speaking. For a moment Darius did not move. The hum of the air conditioner down the hallway continued softly, and the red digits of the wall clock shifted from 1:24 to 1:25. Outside, the storm had nearly passed, leaving only a faint mist drifting across the empty interstate parking lot. The long night that had begun with thunder and flashing headlights had settled into the calm stillness of early morning. Darius looked at the card on the counter again, then slowly lifted his eyes back to Victoria. He was not a man easily surprised, but the weight of what she had just said took a moment to reach him. For 3 years his world had been simple and quiet, measured by midnight check-ins, coffee refills, and the soft routine of making sure travelers had what they needed before morning arrived. Now the future she had placed in front of him felt almost unreal in comparison to the steady rhythm of the night shift he had grown used to. He exhaled slowly before speaking. "Ma'am, I have always tried to take care of the people who walk through that door." His voice remained calm but thoughtful. "That has always been enough for me." Victoria listened without interrupting. The faint smile that appeared on her face carried the calm confidence of someone who had already made up her mind. "That is exactly why it will not be enough anymore," she replied gently. Darius glanced again toward the couch where Noah slept. The boy had rolled onto his side during the conversation, one small hand resting against the edge of the blanket while the dinosaur keychain on his backpack caught a small reflection from the overhead lights. Darius walked quietly across the lobby and adjusted the blanket around Noah's shoulders once more before returning to the desk. Victoria watched the simple gesture carefully. When he stepped back behind the counter, she spoke again. "You see responsibility the way it was always meant. To be seen," she said, "not as authority over people, but as care for them." She paused briefly, letting the quiet words settle into the still room. That is the kind of leadership most companies forget how to recognize. The clock changed again. 1:28. Outside, the sky along the horizon had begun to soften slightly, the first faint hint of early morning appearing beyond the dark clouds that were slowly drifting east. Victoria reached for her coat and slipped it back over her shoulders, preparing to leave. "Tomorrow morning I will have my office contact you," she said calmly. "We will arrange the conversation properly." Darius nodded slowly, still absorbing the shift that had begun unfolding during the last hour of the night. Victoria turned toward the glass doors leading to the parking lot, then paused before stepping outside. She looked back across the quiet lobby one last time. Darius stood behind the counter, steady and composed as he had been when she first arrived. Noah slept peacefully on the couch beneath the gray blanket. The small hotel had returned to the gentle rhythm of early morning travelers and quiet responsibility. Victoria gave a small nod of respect before opening the door. Cool night air drifted briefly into the lobby as she stepped outside toward the waiting car in the lot. The door closed softly behind her. Inside the building the silence remained, warm and steady beneath the fluorescent lights. Darius stood for a moment watching the mist settle over the empty highway. Then he looked down at the card still resting on the counter. Beyond the windows, the first pale line of sunrise slowly began to appear across the horizon, and for the first time since the storm had started hours earlier, the night finally gave way to morning.